Today, Melissa, Stephen, and I are talking about goal setting, change in your church, and we have an invitation for you at the end. It's the Sustainable Ministry Show. This is episode 31. It was a terrible question. Well, hey, everybody. We are back with the Sustainable Ministry Show once again. We are so glad that you are joining us for this week and continue to join us each and every week. We're thankful for you and for your participation in all of this. Once again, hanging out with Stephen Ingram and Melissa Rao. And today we're going to spend some time talking about some goal setting and what that looks like in your churches and how that takes place. This idea really came, and it's something I had thought about in the past, but I heard it new recently as a pastor was wrapping up his sermon. It landed in a place that somewhat equated serving in a mission program that the church was planning with truly becoming disciples who serve. And I felt like it just was not landing in the place that they wanted. The outcome that they had spoken about was, creating disciples who serve. And yet the culmination of that was to participate in a planned and programmed event. That may be a part of serving, but I don't know that that's the outcome they were hoping for. But it was how it got communicated. And it just began to raise some questions in me and in my ministry. Have I raised people in ministry to serve when it's planned by someone else? Or have I raised people in ministry who serve because it's a part of who they are? And I just began to think like that is about goal setting and doing the work that's necessary to achieve those larger goals. What are some goals that you guys have seen churches have success with in ministry?
Man, I feel like that's a huge question. I feel like churches have lots of goals.
Yeah.
I think some of them are good goals. I think some of them are lofty. I think some of them are pipe dreams. And I think the bad ones aren't necessarily bad ideas or bad goals, but they're not necessarily in line with who they are as a church. So I feel like the best goals are goals that are truly reflective, that have organically grown from a process of collaboration and a unified vision, and that those goals then complement their mission of where they say they're going and how they're going to get there. So I know that sounds super ambiguous, and I'm hoping over the next 20 minutes or so, that huge statement that I just said will begin to make sense by the time we're done. So I'm going to throw that in Stephen's lap and help him and have him kind of break that down for y'all.
Well, yeah, thanks, Melissa.
We're all counting on you, man.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I think for me, I pulled back to, for me, what feels more like a fundamental question of, are we trying to invite and recruit people to programs and events and services? Or are we inviting them into a larger understanding of life and community? And for me, that's sort of the first place we have to start, because I think most churches, and we talked about this last week with communication, most churches go from really work their communication plans trying to get people from this event to that event to that event to that event. And that feels like filler to people, and most people don't need filler. Most people are trying to declutter their lives, not clutter it. And so the first question I would ask, are we trying to get people to events and services? Or are we trying to help them understand their life, their community, their family, their calling and their passions in the larger context of the kingdom of God? And so that's kind of the first place. And I think if most churches are honest, most churches are inviting people to programs, events, and services. To kind of jump into what Melissa was saying, I think there's two ways that we can set kind of long-term goals. One is from within the community. So we're talking to people, we're talking to leadership, we're doing surveys, we're really trying to understand where people want to go. And then the other one is more the prophetic role, where you kind of stand out in front of them and call them forward as a leader. I think it's a double-edged sword for both. If you do it from within the community, the belief, and most of the time I think the reality, is that you will get more buy-in because they'll hear their voices reflected. And so there's a beautiful, sustainable piece to that. The other side of the sword on that, though, is if you ask people what their favorite flavor of ice cream is and they've only had chocolate their whole life, they're probably going to say chocolate. People don't know to say what they've never experienced. And so unless you have some really strong leadership in the church that has gone farther than the church itself has, you're probably not going to cast your vision too far out. It'll probably look like and reflect things that you've done in the past. The flip side of it, if you try to be prophetic and kind of lead from in front, the positive side is that you really can push and call people way farther than they probably have gone as a whole. Obviously, I think everybody knows the flip side of this. The other side of the sword is that, man, you can walk out on that limb and call everybody forward, and then they cut the limb out from under your feet. And so, there's positives and negatives of both. I would like to think that there's a way to blend the two. I don't know if I know that way yet. So I think both are good, but both also have their drawbacks.
Yeah. Brian, what about you? I'm curious. What good goals have you seen?
Well, I think, and it gets to some of what you were saying. I think the best goals. It's hard to name a good goal, really. It was a terrible question that I asked you guys to start with.
It really was. Let it be noted.
I like the question, Brian.
I'm just teasing.
But I think the easiest goal often for us is to name some kind of attendance goal. But the best goals are the ones that help us achieve our vision. And I think that's what it comes down to. The best goals are the ones that help us achieve our vision and help move us forward towards it. I think often they're going to stretch us a little bit. I also think it's easy for us to say like simple goals that we would do anyways. And sometimes we might need to do that, but I think sometimes we set those goals as, like a church may say, we're just going to maintain who we've got already for the rest of the year. You don't necessarily need to name that to achieve it. Maybe there's a time, but I think there's a tendency for us to name the goals that we would already do. Like, maybe personally, I'm going to work 5 days a week this week. That's my goal. And I'm just going to do that anyways, right? So, like, the goals need to stretch us and move us and steer us forward and propel us into something different, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will often treat goal setting as a lofty exercise. However, I think goal setting is absolutely critical in moving your ministry forward to a common, a common vision. So I feel like goal setting, when you have a goal, that should be building in accountability for you in maintaining and trying to achieve your mission statement. Your goals is what gives your mission legs, if you will. And so for every goal you have, you should have very concrete steps of what you should be doing throughout the year in order to achieve those goals. Because without those steps, your goal is just a lofty idea and you're not going to see it come to fruition.
That's right. A good ministry friend of mine says it this way. He talks about your goal should always be more than you can accomplish. And when you ask him the follow-up question, why is that? He says, because if you can accomplish it, that means you can do it without God. And I think a lot of times that's what we do. We set goals that we can accomplish, that don't stretch us, that don't cause us to wake up in the middle of the night with some panic or with some fear. And that I think that's okay for business, and I think it's okay for the corporate world. But when we talk about these kind of kingdom values, and as a church, there's another factor at play. I think that we do have this sense that maybe God is calling us to do something that we can't do, and the only way it can be accomplished is if we have to say, man, there is no way we can do it. This is greater than the sum of the parts. And then that there is sort of a faith thing on that. Now, I'm not saying go out and take a $10 million loan out on a $150,000 building. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about. But I do think that a lot of times we sell God short when we're doing our goals, and when we're thinking about long-term plans.
Well, and if it doesn't stretch you, I think as a church and maybe as a leader, then what you were saying is we are okay with how things are right now. Which is kind of like in opposition of a goal. A goal tends to be something that is either bigger or larger or different than what we currently have or what we're currently doing. And in which case, if it doesn't move you to rely on God, to trust in something different, or to adopt new practices in how you go about your work, you're really saying it's okay as it is right now. And not that that's a bad thing, but you're taking that as like, yeah, I'm okay with 10 people. This is fine.
But see, what you just kind of said, Brian, means that when you goal set, change is anticipated. Whether that be a change of numbers, whether that be a change of programming. And that big C word is a word that many
Please don't say it again.
churches struggle with. Right? What did you say?
I said, please don't say it again.
So now I think that will separate the churches that are thriving from the churches that might find themselves in decline and maybe even some financial hardship and trouble. Goal setting implies change, and change is something I think churches, the one thing that they want more of, and honestly, I think this is across board, for the exception of the few Debbie Downers who don't want to change, that their church is perfect just the way it is. Most people will say they want to grow. Most churches want more people. That is pretty much standard through all the churches with whom I've worked. And so when you're talking about growth is a change in numbers, and only change begets change. And so things need to change for us to be able to grow. We can't just do the same old thing year in and year out and expect a different yield. And so it's through goal setting, when everybody comes together and kind of decides what things should look like in the future and what our goals should be, that gives the church something to work towards in a unified way.
Yeah, if someone has said no to your, this is what it's causing me to think about, is if somebody has said no to your church, your program, your ministry, your event, doing the same thing with a new invitation will result in the exact same response. They'll continue to say no to that. And so it requires, maybe it's a different form of communication, maybe it's a different way that we go about what we're doing, maybe it's a different target or whatever, but it's going to require change no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, navigating change is I think it's one of the, I agree with Melissa completely. I think it is one of the defining points of at least the modern Western church. I don't want to speak globally by any means, but I think for the modern Western church, I really think that's a fork in the road. Are you willing to process and adapt and ultimately change? Or are you going to say, no, this is who we are in every sense of the word, and I would argue maybe be willing to die on that battlefield. And for the ones who are trying to, and I think it's prophetic when you say the word change, right? In any way, the ones who are trying to do that are I think maybe having a more difficult time than maybe ever before, because of how unstable things feel to people. The instability in our current system that's kind of inherent in our country right now. There's just this fear, and we've talked about the anxiety and fear and instability. I think it makes people that much more change averse, because the church is a place that has felt stable, and that it feels like, well, I can depend on this to be the same. And so I think it might make it even more difficult for church leaders to do change right now.
Mm.
And one of the things that seems to be helpful with change is speaking clearly about where it is we're headed. and not leaving a lot of room for interpretation in that, just being clear about the goals that are ahead of us and where we're headed. So if we can for a few minutes, let's assume that a church has a vision statement that's in place, and they're in a place where they're doing some goal setting to help move things forward. What are some tips you might give to a church leader in writing a goal and drafting a goal, communicating that thing so that it's clear?
Number one,
I
it's
feel
got to be
like-
measurable.
Yeah. I was just say, I feel like smarter people before us have already come up with an amazing acronym.
Yeah.
Many people have heard of those SMART goals, so they should be specific, measurable, achievable, results-based or relevant, and time-sensitive. And so, but I don't feel like you should be setting a goal that can be achieved in the next year. One thing that Ministry Architects does when we facilitate amazing visioning retreats, summits, if you will, it's a very, very long process. I think we put in 12 to 15 hours with groups of folks. And as a result, organically, their unified vision has emerged. But we recommend them developing 3-year revolving goals. So these are goals that can't be achieved within the next year. They've got to be looking out 3 years from now. And then each year they're going to maybe, depending upon the benchmark that they had from that 3-year revolving goal, they're going to either evaluate what that goal needs to be. Does it need to be higher? Does it need to be lower, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of one of the things that we recommend doing.
I'm wondering, Melissa, based on what you said, and of course my own experience leading those visioning summits, one of the things I think so helpful about doing goal setting, which is specific, measurable in that setting, is we also have paired that with this long-range dreaming where we're thinking years and years in advance of what the church and ministry might look like. And that helps play a role in crafting something that's 3 years, that's much bigger and larger than right now. But if somebody's leading this like with a church council that's doing some stuff, is there a way that they can incorporate dreaming into that to help move things forward to that place where it's 3 years and we're not just thinking about like, well, we got to get a new newsletter going?
I mean, one of the tools that we do to get people dreaming is to kind of, if they were going to write a story, if they were going to open the newspaper in 10 years, what kind of headline they'd like to see about the church or the ministry in which, for which they're visioning, what would the headline be and what would the story say? That's something that little exercise can get people really thinking about what's really important to them about what the church is about. So that's one neat little trick.
I think one way to go about it, especially hopefully if you're in a situation like that, hopefully your room that you're leading or the group that you're leading this process with, hopefully they have a diversity in age. Hopefully you have all different segments of your church represented, especially in terms of age. And I would almost address each age specifically. So for the older people in the room, what's the legacy you want to leave behind? Because that's where their mind's at right now. What's the legacy I'm going to leave behind? What is this going to be? What is this place going to be about when I'm gone? Right. So talk about legacy with the older group, with the ones who have older kids and kids in high school and that sort of thing. I think what you can talk about is what kind of place would you have created for your kids? If you could go back and do it all over again, because I think when I hear parents all the time when they have older kids in high school or going to college, they always go back and say, there's some things I would have done differently, right? So what kind of place would you create for your kids if you could do it all over again? And then when you go to those younger families and younger people in church, what kind of place do you want to create for your kids to grow up in? And so and those are some narrow groupings, but to kind of address it, kind of where people are in their place in life, I think is helpful because it allows them to think about those goals, not just from the 30,000 foot overarching perspective, but how do my personal dreams and hopes and fears play into where we're moving as a church? And so I would address it more specifically like that.
And I think you're spot on. I think one thing that you said, Bryant, you mentioned church boards. I feel like too many churches stop there. And I love the imagery that Stephen just created, getting input from older folks who are more focused on legacy, and folks who have kids, maybe empty nesters, and then some younger folks with babies and little small children. I think too often in our church councils or boards, they tend to be they tend to be the ones who've been around forever. And they tend to be of a very specific older dynamic. And I feel like too often churches who do this visioning will do it with that board. But we have to remember that often our boards are rotating, and they rotate often. So someone who might be very influential and very involved in church, who may not be serving on the board this year, doesn't mean that he or she might not be serving on the board, 4 to 5 years down the road. So I think it's really important. I'd encourage you all to consider including anybody who wants to be a part of that process, to indeed be invited into that process. Anybody who cares enough to say, I want in and I want to own this vision, invite them to come along, and don't just stop with the church leadership and the elder board or the church council. Invite your young families, invite, folks with younger kids, invite new members in addition to your long-term church members, etc. I think it's super important for a truly organic vision, a unified vision where we're all headed together. It's important to include those folks.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, especially with what you said at the end about inviting new folks to the community. Folks who have said, hey, I'm invested, I'm here, but you're right. Most of the time, the people that we invite to those conversations are insiders and long-term insiders. And it's very hard if you're an insider, and especially a long-term insider, for you to have perspective on your current ministry and the ministry you've done for the past 10 years. And to get that new set of new paint eyes in there. I mean, I love when we have new folks into the church, or a new person on staff. I will tell them, especially new person on staff, I'll say, everything you see that doesn't make sense, every sign you see that's out of place, every nick in the carpet, everything you see, please write it down, because your perspective is probably the most valuable perspective we can get. And so to include folks who are on the front end of their journey, not the back end, is wildly important, because this can give you a whole different perspective than you've ever seen before.
Great point.
And I might say, people would argue, probably would argue with this. In fact, I know one who has. But I might say that having a bad goal is better than no goal at all. And let's at least try to live into that thing. If it's poorly written, it's not measurable or whatever, but it still is leading us to something that's going to cause us to change a little bit. Let's live into it. We can rewrite that goal or restate it or change it later on, but at least put something before you. At least put something before the folks that you're working with, and have them speak into that, and do that, and then live into it, and see where you land. You can certainly take it another step further, but put something. Something's better than nothing in this case.
If nothing else, is a placeholder. And that's why I hear you say, Brian.
Yeah. It at least means you're dreaming.
Yeah, that's right.
You're at least thinking about what could be next. And so even if that's stated terribly, and it is super lofty and it is all broad, we wouldn't recommend that you create lofty goals. But a lofty goal is better than no goal.
Yeah.
For sure. We just got to remember what goals are. Goals aren't cute ideas. Goals are something, they're part of strategy. And I think too few churches actually goal set in a way that is moving their mission forward. I think many churches will have good ideas, but unless they have that unified vision and they're working towards their goals together, everybody brings their own idea of what success looks like. I know there are some people in our church who have wildly different ideas of how many people should be sitting in the pews on Sunday mornings, or how how many children should be going to Sunday school that morning, or how many youth are in the youth group, et cetera, or how many women are creating prayer shawls, et cetera. Everybody has their own idea of what that goal should be. So unless there is a specific and strategic process that's in place that can kind of get many people in the room together agreeing or compromising on what's important and what's not, it's very difficult for everybody to come together and be moving together. So yeah, I think that unified vision is super important to the whole idea behind what goal is. It's not so much important about the senior pastor's lofty goal. If he or she has that lofty goal and is keeping it in his or her office and isn't necessarily stating what that goal is, so everybody's moving toward achieving it together.
Yeah, that's right. Broad-based ownership is huge.
For sure.
Well, you guys have shared a lot. You've shared a lot based on a really terrible question to get us going here. So,
hey Brian,
I'm glad you guys are here.
No question at all.
What's that?
A terrible question is better than no question at all, Brian. I believe in your logic. It's a placeholder for a better question.
which hopefully we'll have next week.
No, it's good. It's good.
That's awesome. Well, before we go, Melissa, you had this wonderful idea that you shared with Stephen and I, kind of behind the scenes, last week's recording. You want to kind of pose that to folks?
So what I would love to do is we're going to be having these great conversations, and it's me and Stephen and Bryant. And I think it would be so great to get to kind of make the conversation bigger and include our listeners and our watchers into that conversation. So at the end of every segment that we do, we are going to pose a question to you all. It maybe something stood out to you from our podcast, or you have a great illustration of what you're doing that's really working in your ministry and you want to celebrate it. We want to celebrate with you. And so we are inviting you to email us. You can email me. My email address is melissa@ministryarchitects.com, or you can send me a tweet at Melissa Rao. Super easy, 1 L, 2 S's, R-A-U. You can send me a tweet or send me an email and kind of make a comment or share something that you're doing that really works. Or maybe you learned something that you were excited about and can't wait to try, etc. We'd really like to share your thoughts or comments, your feedback at the beginning of each segment going forward. So if you have anything you'd like to share, please get in touch with us, because we'd like to celebrate you in our future podcasts.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for doing that and setting that up. Stephen, how can folks keep up with you between now and next Wednesday?
Yep, I'd love to hear from you at good grief, 12stonespirituality.com, which is where I blog. You can always email me, Stephen, S-T-P-H-E-N, at ministryarchitects.com. And you can hang out with me on the Twitter and the Facebook as well as the interweb. So I'd love to see you there.
All of the interwebs?
All the interwebs.
You're just there.
All the interwebs, yeah.
I think I feel your spirit sometimes in the midst of my Facebook travels.
That's
occasionally. And you guys can certainly reach out to me, Bryant, B-R-Y-A-N-T, 1Y, 1T. At ministryarchitects.com or facebook.com/Brian Johnson. And we will see you guys next week.
Take care.
Yay.
Ha ha!